these lectures, so if you haven't already signed up, be sure to do so soon. So tonight, I know we're excited to hear from Amelia Bundles, who kicks off our Great Homes and Gardens lecture series to share vintage photographs and stories from her book, Joy Goddess, Amelia Walker, and the Harlem Renaissance. So please join us for a book signing after the lecture, which will be right outside in the theater, and I'm sure you know we have books available upstairs in the museum shop. Now, before I hand over the mic to Amelia, I wanted to just share a little bit about her. She's the author of 5 books, including Joy Goddess, Amelia Walker, and the Harlem Renaissance, and that's a biography of her great-grandmother, whose parties, arts patronage, and convenings shaped the social and cultural scene of that era. On her own ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, a New York Times notable book about her entrepreneurial great-great-grandmother, is the fact-based biography that inspired Self-Made, which was a fictional 4-part Netflix series. I'm sure many of you saw it. And it starred Octavia Spencer. It was great. Amelia founded the Madam Walker Family Archives, the largest private collection of Walker ephemera, photographs, and correspondence. And I'm also very proud to say that Amelia is a member of Hillwood's International Council, so we consider her one of our own. Now, please join me in welcoming Amelia Bundles to the microphone.
Thank you, Kate. It's always good to be here. And well, you all. Well, give or take a few days. On February 12th, 2020, I was here talking about Madam Walker's home, Villa Lawaro, and it was one of the last public events I did before the world shut down for the pandemic. So it's wonderful to be back. And I was working on this book, Joy Goddess, at the time. So let me, and we have a new audio visual here. This is like, as things have opened up, there's like a touch screen. It's so wonderful. So hello to the folks who are watching online. It's exciting for me to be able to talk about these women in my family. And Madam C.J. Walker, of course, is the more well-known of the two, but I always have wanted to write about Amelia Walker. We share a name. We almost share a birthday. I'm June 7th. She's June 6th, a few years apart. But I wrote a report about Amelia Walker when I was in high school in 1970. So that's how long I've been working on this book. And when I wrote On Her Own Ground that came out in 2001, I thought I was doing a double biography. And I realized at some point in the research and writing process that Amelia Walker needed her own story. But I will say there would be no Amelia Walker, the Joy Goddess of Harlem, as Langston Hughes called her, had there not been Madam C.J. Walker. And Madam Walker's origin story is born Sarah Breedlove on the same plantation in Delta, Louisiana, where her parents and older siblings had been enslaved. She was born in 1867, first child in her family born free. Orphaned at 7, she got married, she said, at 14, she said, to get a home of my own, essentially self-preservation, because after her parents died, she had moved in with her sister and brother-in-law, who she said was so cruel that I had to get away. She married a man named Moses McWilliams, and their one child, Lelia, who later changed her name to Alelia, was born in 1885. And after Moses, her husband, died when she was 20 and her daughter was 3, she moved up the river to St. Louis, where her older brothers had moved a decade earlier, as part of one of the early migrations of African Americans from the South, as it became clear that sharecropping was not going to be a good way to make a living. And also after the 1876 presidential election, where there was a lot of racial violence. Her brothers had been involved with their family minister in politics, and the backlash to black political power meant that they were chased out of Madison Parish by the Ku Klux Klan. Her brothers ended up settling in St. Louis, and they became barbers at a time when black men dominated the barbering trade. And as it turns out, their barbershop was very near St. Paul African Methodist Episcopal Church. They introduced their sister Sarah to the ladies of the church, the more educated women, the women who ran the missionary society. Sarah Breedlove had become a washerwoman because that was the only way for her to make money in the city. But she had a good enough voice to be in the choir. And so she was in this choir with these educated women who began to give her a vision of herself as something other than an illiterate washerwoman. They made sure that her daughter was enrolled in school, even when she had to work away from home. She had to sometimes stay away from home, and her daughter was placed in the colored orphans' home. She was considered a half orphan because her father died. There were no daycare centers then, and so that was the way that her daughter was taken care of. But she really did benefit from these women. Some of them were in a national organization of black women, educated black women who were interested in suffrage and who were interested in community uplift. So she really began to see what could happen when women collaborated with each other. Like many women of her era, she was going bald. Now, why? You can see her in the middle. Because most Americans didn't have indoor plumbing or electricity. People didn't bathe very often. We know there were public baths. We know the phrase throwing out the baby with the bath water, and that was because if you had to go out and pump the water, heat the water in the number 2 tin tub, everybody bathed in the same water. And so the phrase throw out the baby with the bath water is supposedly because they weren't sure there was a baby in there. But that probably apocryphal. But it meant that not only did people not bathe as often, hygiene was just really different, and people washed their hair even less often than they bathed. And so a lot of people had not just bad dandruff, but scalp infections and scalp disease. And Sarah Breedlove was one of those women. She was losing her hair. Her brothers were barbers. She learned something from them about hair care. And then for a while, she sold products that were made by a woman named Annie Malone, who later would become her major competitor. But neither Malone nor Walker were the first ones to use this formula. It's a centuries-old formula that shows up in textbooks, in pharmaceutical journals, and it was essentially a shampoo. For Madam Walker, at least, it was what she came up with, was a shampoo, a vegetable shampoo, less harsh than the lye soaps that were being used at the time, and an ointment like Vaseline, petrolatum, which is essentially Vaseline, with sulfur as a medicinal curative. And once your hair and your scalp were clean, you applied this ointment with the sulfur. That meant your scalp was healthy and your hair could grow back. So you could see the before and after picture that it really did work. But again, neither Madam Walker nor her competitor were the first ones to create this product. Cuticura had been around before then. So these were things that lots of people needed, but it was at a time when these products were not available commercially. So Madam Walker, Elizabeth Arden, Helena Rubinstein, they were all contemporaries. But women, this idea of cosmetics for women, hair care products for women, this was new. There was not this market, and those were the women who really began to develop this national distribution. So this is, Madam Walker is, at this point, she's still Sarah Breedlove in St. Louis, selling Malone's products. She moves to Denver, where she has a widowed sister-in-law, and 4 nieces. She has now sent her daughter to Knoxville College, to the high school, for $7.86 a semester. She'd saved enough money from her washing jobs. She's in Denver. Her good friend Charles Joseph Walker, who's a newspaper man in St. Louis, joins her there. They get married, and she begins to call herself Madam C.J. Walker. She wants to make sure that nobody calls her by her first name, nobody disrespects her. And madam was a title that women who were in business used, whether if you owned a boarding house or you were a caterer or a seamstress. If you see old ads from the 1800s, it would be Madam Jones. And, Paris was the center of fashion and cosmetics at that time. And so, yes, it was a bit of an affectation, but she was really trying to ensure that she was respected. So in Denver, she and Charles Joseph Walker were putting ads in the newspaper. She then brought her daughter to Denver to run the mail order operation so she and her new husband could travel around the southern and southwestern United States, recruiting agents, selling products. And then they settled briefly in Pittsburgh. And in Pittsburgh, her daughter then joined her in Pittsburgh. They're running that operation. And she moves to Indianapolis. Indianapolis, where I grew up, my hometown, and my homegirl, Marie Johns, is here. Indianapolis had a very thriving black business community in 1910. There were 3 black newspapers, one that was nationally distributed, kind of like a USA Today. She took out ads, and so because lots of trains went through Indianapolis every day, the Pullman porters and black men who worked on the trains would take a big stack of the papers and sell them as they traveled around the country. And so people were now seeing her ads wherever in different cities around the country. And so 1910, she opens a factory, she buys a house, and her daughter comes to visit her from Pittsburgh. So you can see she's come a long way from that cabin and from that before and after picture. This is about 1911. She founded the company in 1906, and by now she already has a chauffeur. She loved to entertain. Remember, she had been in the choir in St. Louis, and they actually met a lot of some of the musicians who would become very famous decades later. They were their friends in St. Louis, and at this point, they were very mobile. They were among the most mobile African Americans in the country, and the other people who were also very mobile were the entertainers. And so they made lots of friends with other musicians and composers and theater people, and those became the people that they supported in the arts. And this just happens to be a dance that Madam Walker hosted for her daughter when her daughter visited from Pittsburgh. This is her factory in Indianapolis, so you can see she's really, just a few years after she's founded the company, she now has a C-suite. Her executive team is really quite competent, very talented. That made a huge difference. It was one of the reasons I think that she's more remembered than some of her competitors, because she surrounded herself with such great people. So her daughter, running the Pittsburgh office, and seeing that with New York as part of her territory, she could see that the sales in Harlem were starting to outstrip the sales in Pittsburgh. And this is as Harlem is becoming the cultural and political center of Black America. And so Alelia persuades her mother to buy a townhouse on 136th Street near Lenox Avenue. She's one of the first Black homeowners in Harlem. And you can see these 2 townhouses on the left. She first buys 108 West 136th Street. Then she buys 110 West 136th Street and hires Vertner Tandy, the first licensed Black architect in New York, to redesign the house into this beautiful house. The first floor is the beauty salon. Upstairs are their living quarters. In all of their homes, there are music rooms. So even though neither woman played an instrument, their friends did. And so as they began to entertain, they wanted to make sure that there was a place for their friends to play, to perform. This is the beauty salon that's on the first floor. The beauty school, Lelia College, named after her daughter, in the basement. And then as they're developing the business, Alelia is coming to visit her mother in Indianapolis, and one of the things that they did was to network with their friends who were in the AME church. Everywhere Madam Walker moved and where Alelia Walker moved, they would join the AME church. They joined Bethel AME, or Madam Walker joined Bethel AME after she arrived in Indianapolis, and one of the parishioners in the church was a woman named Samira Thomas. And Sarah Breedlove, Madam Walker, realized that she had known Samira's son, Elijah, in St. Louis. This is the connection that people were making through church. And Elijah, it turns out that Elijah's mother, who was a member of the church, lived across the alley from Madam Walker. And when Madam Walker realized this connection, she became close to the family. And Elijah's sister had recently lost her husband. Her name was Sarah Etta Hammond. And she was the third generation of women in her family to have been widowed in her 30s with 7 or 8 children. And among the children was this young girl, May, who was my grandmother. And my grandmother was adopted by A'Lelia Walker. And you see, May has very long braids. And Madam Walker's main product was Madam Walker's Wonderful Hair Grower. So for a while, Madam Walker had her as a model. She would demonstrate her wonderful hair grower, even though May already had very long hair. That's nothing like what happens today in advertisements. She was featured on one of the pamphlets, and so that's how I became connected. And I think at this point they're very lucky that A'Lelia Walker adopted my grandmother May, because they have me to tell the story. So we're going to talk about A'Lelia Walker and Joy Goddess, but I like showing this because this is Madam Walker at her first national convention of her sales agents in 1917. So this is 11 years after she founded the company. She has now trained thousands of women all over the United States, the Caribbean, and Central America. These are women who otherwise would have been sharecroppers and maids and laundresses who now have their own businesses, their own streams of income. And she has modeled this on what she learned from the women in the AME Church, what she learned from the women in the National Association of Colored Women, a national organization of suffragists and community-minded people. And at this convention, she gave prizes not just to the women who sold the most products, but to the women who contributed the most to charity. This is a couple of years before Mary Kay was born. She had this idea of prizes. And she told the women in her keynote speech, I want you to understand that as Walker agents, your first duty is to humanity. I want others to look at us and realize that we care not just about ourselves, but about others. And at the end of the convention, the women sent a telegram to President Woodrow Wilson urging him to support legislation to make lynching a federal crime. So this was an army of activist women. This is the silent protest parade. This was around the same time that African Americans were marching in New York to protest the recent massacre in East St. Louis. And of course, across the river from St. Louis, where Madam Walker had lived for many years. But of course, that kind of larger-than-life mother can be a little intimidating to a child. I mean, we all know, we may ourselves have been that person or had seen that. It's very hard to live up to the expectations that other people have for you and that the expectations that others impose. But A'Lelia Walker was trying to find her own way of expressing herself. And one of the things she did is her mother had been, very much a philanthropist and very active. And during World War I, they both were supporting black soldiers. And what A'Lelia Walker did during World War I is to become very involved as a volunteer with the Red Cross. And she had been known for giving parties. She and her mother gave great parties. And she'd been fundraising. Lots of women were knitting socks and getting razors and cigarettes to send off to the troops. But A'Lelia Walker had a much grander idea. She decided that she was going to rent out the Manhattan Casino in Harlem and invite her friend Enrico Caruso to do a cameo because she knew that her friends loved opera. And Enrico Caruso, at the last minute, couldn't come, but they had already sold all the tickets, and so they were able to raise the money for this ambulance that was sent to France for the black soldiers. And even though Enrico Caruso couldn't come, he had been in 50 performances in, as many weeks, and his voice was strained. He needed to take a rest. But a little while after this, he visited Villa Lawaro, visited the home that Madam Walker was building in Irvington, New York. And he said to Amelia that as he walked around, oh, and I should say this, Amelia had persuaded her mother to move to New York. She was in Indianapolis, the company was headquartered there, but Madam Walker's health was starting to deteriorate. She had hypertension. She was still getting around okay, but she decided that she was going to move to New York, her personal residence, while the company remained headquartered in Indianapolis. But that beautiful townhouse, she wrote to her attorney, F.B. Ransom, and said, "This is lovely, but it's not big enough for two women." And so she needed her own home. So she hired that same architect, Vertner Tandy, to design this house in Irvington, New York, just a not too far from Jay Gould's Lyndhurst and a few miles away from John D. Rockefeller's Kykuit. But when Caruso visited the house when it was under construction, he said it reminded him of homes in Naples. And he came upon the name for the house, and he called it Lewaro, using letters from Lelia Walker Robinson, who was her now departed first husband. So Lewaro. And that name is still the name. Hi, Jane. I didn't see you. That is the name that it still goes by. And like the houses, the other homes, there's a music room with a piano and a gold-trimmed Victrola. And there was an organ that was piped throughout the house. Madam Walker moved into the house in May of 1918 and died there in May of 1919. So she had one Christmas there, one birthday there. Amelia became the president of the company. This is the C-suite, the executive team, very competent. Fortunately, Madam Walker had wisely chosen her executives because by now Amelia Walker is really in New York. Her life is in New York, and the company, the manufacturing, the distribution, all of those things are being run out of Indianapolis. But she's still the head of the New York office, and she's here getting a manicure and overseeing the shampooing. Now, Amelia and her mother, so for those of you who saw the Netflix series, there's so much that's not accurate, and I won't go off on a tangent. But I will say Amelia Walker did not have a girlfriend named Esther. They were trying to create some kind of conflict between mother and daughter, and the real conflict was this. So Amelia Walker had two boyfriends, both doctors, both handsome. One was a bad boy, one was a good guy. Her mother liked, wait a minute, somebody just said the bad boy. It stuns me when it stuns me. So, maybe Mama might have liked the bad boy, but I don't think that was true. I mean, it's for herself, not for her daughter. But that is not true. I just that's my joke. But of course, Madam Walker preferred the good guy. And she could see that the bad boy was a little haughty, where the other guy was humble, but both very talented people. So right before, in early 1919, when Madam Walker is sort of tussling with her daughter about the two men, Amelia agrees to go on a trip. She and my grandmother go to South America, and this is a way for Amelia to kind of clear her head and get things in perspective and hopefully make the right decision. And a week before Madam Walker dies, Amelia has written to her from Panama saying, "I have decided to marry Kennedy, the good guy, and not Wiley, the bad boy." And her mother writes a letter back to her saying, "I'm so glad that you have decided to do this because I never thought Wiley would make you happy." Madam Walker dies, Amelia Walker and my grandmother come back. They miss the funeral because the boats are delayed, and it's just the whole, if you've read Joy Goddess, you know what happens. And Amelia Walker then marries Wiley Wilson, the bad boy, on her 34th birthday. So Wiley behaves exactly as her mother has predicted. And she's married to him for a while. It's just, he has an affair. It's just, all the things, all the drama. And she decides that she is going to do kind of an eat, pray, love thing. And so she sails to Paris in 1921. She stays on the Champs-Élysées in one of the most luxurious hotels. And during this trip, she visits Egypt. She's at the pyramids. She goes to Rome, Monte Carlo, Addis Ababa, Palestine, and sort of meets friends, sees friends, hangs out in Paris, and then comes back and has some great ideas about marketing. She's kind of gotten this out of her system. You have to read the book to get more of the details. But she's, now she's living her own best life, and she is finding the company is being operated by the people in Indianapolis, and she's expressing herself, and she's really quite an impresario. She knows how to do big events, and among the big events is my grandmother's wedding. Now, you will notice my grandmother is not very happy because she is marrying the evil Dr. Jackson. Alelia Walker has arranged this marriage. That's more drama. Eventually, my grandmother is happy, but not with this marriage. But it's still Alelia Walker's big grand events. I think she's not the first heiress to marry somebody she didn't want to marry. In 1924, the Walker agents meet in New York, and this is the picture at Villa Lawaro. So you can see the house is still magical for people. It's still a place where that inspires people even to this day. At this point, Alelia Walker is actually not in the picture. She's in the window because she had a stroke about 6 months earlier. So she's, sort of part of it is the divorce and just all kinds of things that are going on. But she eventually recovers fully. But it gives me the sense of her trying to always have her own life. And she's called the Joy Goddess because she created joy for people. People said that Alelia Walker didn't just walk into a room, she swept into a room. She was one of the few people who could pull together an amazing array of people, whether it was her Harlem friends, her international friends, royalty from Europe, her queer friends, her straight friends. People loved being around her because she was, as somebody said, that people flocked to her like bees to flowers, and that she would decide to have a party and she would get on the phone and she would say, "Darling, I'm having a party tonight, and it wouldn't be the same without you. Absolutely not." And as Langston Hughes describes, she would have a party and people wouldn't just bring their +1, but their +2, 3, 4, and 5, because when people discovered that they were going to Alelia Walker's, they wanted to be there. She was glamorous. She was a muse for photographers and sculptors and painters because she had such a charismatic personality. As she's still trying to define herself and find ways that she can make her own contribution, in 1927, as some of the young writers like Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen and Zora Neale Hurston are starting to be recognized for their talent, she decides that she's going to convert a floor of her townhouse into what became known as the Dark Tower. So now if you read anything about the Harlem Renaissance, the Dark Tower is always mentioned. And it's become this kind of, mythical place where the artists and writers and musicians and actors of the period would gather there. There were great parties that were there. And so in October of 1927, she sent out invitations, and we dedicate this tower to the aesthetes, that cultural group of young Negro writers, sculptors, painters, music artists, composers, and their friends, a quiet place of particular charm. She wanted people to have a place to come. This is a time when even New York, I won't say even New York, but New York is quite segregated. There are lots of private clubs, but they're not open to African Americans. The Civic Club was the exception. That's the place that became famous because it was the place of the Opportunity Awards dinner where many of the very famous Harlem Renaissance writers were honored in 1925. But there wasn't a place that was open to a wide array of people. And Alelia Walker was really trying to create that place. As she said to Paul Frankel, who was an Austrian designer who did the interior decorating, she said, "I want to create a place, an international place, where people can talk with each other, where they can meet each other, where they can gather." So she had this really clear since. And sometimes in the popular imagination, this has been like a nightclub or a speakeasy. She said, I don't want it to be a nightclub. I want it to be a place where there's culture, where there's music, where there's poetry. This is the original invitation from the Dark Tower. I was listening to someone earlier talking about cleaning out a family house and all the things that are there, and I am so lucky that my grandparents saved everything because I was able to discover these things. And this is the original menu, and my favorite item. I'm told that I can, let's see, do this. Will this work? Wait a minute. There. Great. I love new technology. So right here is A'Lelia Walker iced tea. So it was Prohibition. So I don't know what's in there or what people might have put in there, but I have to imagine that they might have. And then and when she opened the Dark Tower and the designer had done, beautiful tables, and she had monogrammed linen and silverware, and all of these wonderful things that were on the menu. But on either wall, one wall had The Weary Blues by Langston Hughes stenciled on the wall, and on the other wall opposite that was Countee Cullen's From the Dark Tower. That's where the name of the place came. And these two artists, we may lump them together because they're both from the 20s, but their aesthetic was really quite different. Langston Hughes was much more about blues and, sort of the people's expression, and Countee Cullen was much more buttoned up. He really liked to write sonnets. And so to have these two sort of frenemies in many ways on either wall really represented the range of expression from young black poets. I show these books because these are the books that were in my house when I was growing up because my grandparents saved everything. So the first editions of The Weary Blues autographed to A'Lelia Walker and Countee Cullen's collar and Jean Toomer's cane. When I was in high school and when I was writing this first report about A'Lelia Walker, I had not really read a lot of black writers. It's the 1960s. There's no black history or women's history being taught in my school. But I knew that we had these books. And when I read Jean Toomer's cane, it was the most poetic expression that I had ever seen by a black author. And that just opened up my mind and made me want to know more about the Harlem Renaissance and to know more about A'Lelia Walker. At that point, I was not all that interested in Madam Walker because she was much more complicated. But A'Lelia Walker loved to have fun. And this is just more of me showing, what a muse she was for people. The first picture on the left is taken by the very famous photographer Bernice Abbott. The middle piece is a pastel by Richmond Barthé, who was a very well-known sculptor and painter during that period. And then the one on the right is by a sculptor whose name you wouldn't know, but his name was Shelton, but he was a very famous sculptor at the time, and he said that this was one of his favorite pieces of work. He was known for creating large fountains and for doing white celebrities, but he chose this to show in a major exhibit in Paris and then came back and showed it in New York. But it says to me, how she filled up a room, the charisma that she had, and which is why I had to write about her, even though in much of the telling of the Harlem Renaissance, some of the biographies, some of the histories that you may read that were written 20, 30, 40 years ago, they kind of portray A'Lelia Walker as just a dilettante and kind of an airhead, but I knew that couldn't possibly be true, and so I wanted to be able to bring her out from the shadows and tell the stories of a complex woman who didn't always make the right decisions, but who did live a life of consequence. And I'm just showing a couple of pictures before we go to questions, because I love that she entertained her friends at Villa Laurel. She was the one, as I say, who could just get on the phone and say, please come. Here she is hanging out with her girlfriends in front of Villa Laurel. And I love this picture. She's on a trip. One of her good friends, Jerry Major, who was called Geraldine Dismond during the 1920s, and who was a great source for me as I was doing my early research. She told me lots of wonderful stories about A'Lelia Walker, and she said there was one time they had driven with the chauffeur to Virginia, and A'Lelia loaded up the car with Virginia hams and fresh fruit and vegetables, and they sent the driver back driving to New York, and they took the train. But then I can imagine that she's on one of those trips. Then here's A'Lelia Walker at Villa Lawaro in the music room. And she dies in August of 1931. She was only 46 years old. The market had crashed in October 1929, just as she was getting ready to celebrate the second anniversary of the opening of the Dark Tower. And the company's sales were dwindling, as they were everywhere. And my grandfather said A'Lelia Walker knocked herself out because she wanted to be knocked out. Now, that's her son-in-law saying that, but I think it's probably true. She remembered how poor they had been. She did not want to go back to that, and so she continued to live her life fully. She was at a birthday party with a friend in Long Branch, New Jersey. She spent the day on the beach. She had champagne, she had lobster, she had chocolate cake, and then she had a stroke. But her funeral was well attended. People lined up for 3 days. There were, as Langston Hughes said, the people who had tickets, most of them couldn't get in. And so I just like to remember A'Lelia Walker as the joy goddess, the person who lived a life that brought joy to other people, who had... She's talking now. Okay, George. She's coming through. What did I do? George, it's been so wonderful.
If you don't mind, if I can get back here
Sure.
for a second.
So I see my ABC friends, Georgianne and Jane, and so I just have we work to know what's going on here. That you have to just let the man do his thing. Are we good? No. Okay. I'm waiting for the people who are on the Zoom. Yeah. All right. See? Miracles. Gaffer's tape. All right. So I love questions. And I think that if you raise your hand, a microphone will come to you. Here we go.
I have the microphone, so if you raise your hand, I'll come right over.
You know, it's being here this 6 years later, it's like, I don't know, most people don't get to do 2 lectures in this series, so I am really honored. Okay, I see a hand.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed this.
Thank
But
you.
I wondered, is Lawaro, is that how you pronounce it?
Lawaro,
Lawaro open now? Is it owned as a museum where you can go and learn more about?
You know, I wish I
or-
could say that Lawaro is open. Lawaro is a National Historic Landmark, but it's privately owned, and it is not a house museum. The village of Irvington, there are many people who are very supportive, who really appreciate the history, but it's not zoned for public events. But the current owner, Richelieu Dennis, was the founder of a company called Sundial Brands. Richelieu moved to the United States from Liberia in the 1980s to go to Babson College. His mother came for graduation. They couldn't go back because of the Civil War. But they had to make money, and so he and his mother used his Sierra Leonean grandmother's recipe for shea butter. At a time when nobody else was selling shea butter, he created a very successful business. That Shea Moisture and Nubian Heritage, you can see those products all over the place. And when Richelieu sold that company to Unilever, he made a lot of investments. And among the things he did was to buy Villa Lawaro. He had actually bought the trademark to the Walker products. And so for a little while, we had a limited edition of hair care products, but he is the owner. And so they can't have big events. It's near the main street. There's no parking, but there are occasionally wonderful gatherings. There was a wonderful Paris Fashion Week fashion show that happened there. And just a few months ago, because he also owns Essence, there was a women in business event that honored 6 Black women entrepreneurs, including Patti LaBelle, whose pies I make her an entrepreneur, among other things. Ursula Burns, who was the first Black woman CEO of Xerox, and 4 other women. And it was a magical time. So it's only, small events, but it still has that mystique. Other questions?
I loved hearing about this story. It's really brings home a lot of what's happening in my family, and it's wonderful to see these pictures that look so familiar. I'd like to know what are some of the things from your grandmother that you cherish the most?
So what are some of the things from my grandmother that I cherish the most? So when I was a toddler, my mother and I would go visit the apartment where my grandfather lived. My grandmother had died in 1945 when my mother was a freshman at Howard. And when I was 3 years old, in 1955, I'd been born in Chicago, but we were back in Indianapolis. And as my mother and her father would sit in the living room talking about whatever they were talking about, I would sneak off to the bedroom that had been my grandmother's and open the dresser drawers. And among the things in the dresser drawers, an ostrich feather fan, photographs of these women. But the thing that I cherish the most, and something that I found then, were miniature mummy charms that opened up, little sarcophagi that opened up. They were enameled. They fit into my little 3-year-old hands, and I still have them. So that was kind of my entree to the Walker women before I had any idea who they were. And again, because my grandparents saved everything, I have the receipts from that she used when she bought them in Cairo.
Could you comment on your mother's relationship with your grandmother?
Sure. So my mother's parents were divorced when she was in elementary school. So my mother lived between Indianapolis, where her mother was living, and where she now was the president of the Walker Company. And my grandfather's family was in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. So my mother lived between the two places. Because my grandmother died when she was a freshman at Howard, I don't have my own personal memories, but what I do remember is that every year when my mother and I would go shopping at L.S. Ayers, which was the department store in Indianapolis, and we would have lunch in the tea room, she would talk about how she had done that with her mother. She would talk about, how her mother's, the seams in her stockings were always straight. What a lady she was, that she was quiet, that she was dignified. And so that's the memory that I have through my mother. Obviously it was devastating for her mother to die when she was a freshman at Howard. And I would say my mother was perfect. That was the generation, there was a lot of drama, for my grandmother to have been forced to marry somebody she didn't want to marry. It was a disaster. Eventually she divorced him and then married my grandfather. And I can't tell you my grandfather was perfect, but he was a good father. My mother thought he was a great father. But my mother wanted to make sure that my brothers and I had our own path. My mother majored in chemistry and business when she was at Howard. German, she was really smart. I didn't get the science gene. But she knew that she was expected to go to work for the Walker Company, and that was what she did for most of her adult life. But she was very involved in politics and, education, president of the PTA, that kind of thing. But there was never any expectation that I would, quote unquote, go into the family business. My parents both encouraged me to do the thing that I loved, and what I loved was writing. But it turns out that I was able to have a career in journalism. I was able to be a writer, and then I was able to use those skills that I learned to tell the story. So I appreciate that my mother and father encouraged me to follow my own path, and it still led me to a place that I think they would be happy about. Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned your mother went to Howard. Can you talk about any other relationship your family had with HBCUs?
Sure. Here we go. Was this a setup question? Because there is a lot of HBCU story. There's much to tell about that. My grandfather, Marion Perry's father, Marion Perry Sr., was valedictorian of his class in 1883 at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. My grandfather and his brother went to Lincoln University, and my uncle Walker went to Lincoln University, so that's Lincoln. My grandmother May went to Spelman and was on the honor roll and because I was able to use the Spelman archives, I learned that she gave the lecture, the student lecture, because she, I guess, had the highest grade point average. And my mom went to Howard. So yes, the HBCUs are very, very much a part of my heritage. Not that I'm aware of. But though Madam Walker at one point she was giving money. She donated money to black schools and colleges, to Mary McLeod Bethune's, at that point, Daytona Normal Industrial Institute for Girls, Lucy Laney's Haynes Institute, and Charlotte Hawkins Brown's Palmer Memorial Institute, where my mother went to boarding school. She donated money to Tuskegee and a number of other places. And in some of those places, she did set up training schools or training curriculum for people to be Walker beauty culturists. I see a hand over here. Okay. Alelia rhymes with Amelia. So she went to Knoxville. So the question for those who are watching, did Alelia Walker go to college? So she was enrolled at Knoxville College in 1903, 4, something like that. But it was really the high school curriculum. So she was only there for a year or so. So she didn't have a college degree. So did that training, that time at Knoxville help her with what she did? I really don't know the answer to that. But there are a couple of things. I was able to find her enrollment records and a mention of her in one of their newsletters. I mean, I really went down a lot of rabbit holes while I was doing this research. There was a wonderful man named Robert Booker who was the Knoxville College archivist for many years. And one of the things I know from looking at the curriculum is that all of the girls had to take sewing classes. And I know Alelia Walker was a fashionista, so maybe that might have, had some influence on her. I just think that her mother's aspirations for her to save that $7.86 that it took to enroll her in the school must have given her some sense of her importance, that her mother thought she was important, that she thought she was worthy. She wanted to get her away from kind of the rough streets of St. Louis. And so I think when a parent has that kind of investment in you, that it does do something for your self-confidence. So maybe in that way. Great question. Hi, Linda. Hot Springs are. But so because I met somebody earlier today who was from Arkansas or who lives in Fayetteville, and I'm like, I used to spend summers in Arkansas, and Arkansas was complicated. Pine Bluff, Arkansas, where my grandfather's family lived, actually had a really thriving black community because Arkansas A&M was there and had been founded in the 1890s, I think. The first streetcar in Pine Bluff was owned by a black man. A racetrack was owned by a black man. My grandfather came back. He was a jack of all trades in this sense. He was a minister. He had a dry goods store. He was principal of the high school, and he opened a funeral home. So there was a black community that, despite the segregation, managed to thrive. And I can't at Little Rock, I think, something similar happened. So yes, it is segregated. But Hot Springs, Arkansas, which is where the racetrack was, had a long tradition of bathhouses, but a black organization, the Pythians, built their own bathhouse. And then another organization built a bathhouse. So both Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker went to Hot Springs because they knew that they would be taken care of at those two facilities. So that was, the parallel lives, the parallel institutions that were being developed during segregation. I would be happy to answer any additional questions. Is it on? Can you hear me? Let's see. I think the green light is on, so. Okay, great. All right. So what happened to the beauty company? So the 80s, my family and the family of F.B. Ransom, the attorney, the next generations were involved through the 1980s. The trademark was sold to another entity which owned it for about 30 years, but really did not become a major player. And then Richelieu Dennis bought the trademark, and as I mentioned, we had a couple of limited edition product lines. So there are no products that are currently sold, but for a while there were products that were sold at Sephora for a couple of years, and then a limited edition that was at Walmart for about a year or so. So there aren't currently Walker products, but I know where the trademark is. Other questions? All right. Mm-hmm. Sure. So the question was, were there any particular stories or incidents that stood out as I was doing my research? And I would say, yes, dozens, hundreds. Because, writing, this is when I started doing this serious research. Yes, I wrote the paper in high school, but when I was in graduate school at Columbia in journalism, my advisor in the fall of 1975 was a woman named Phyllis Garland. She was the first black woman hired as a tenured faculty at the Columbia Journalism School. And this was, as we're in this period that we're in now, the 1970s were when the academy, the universities were really starting to hire women and people of color in positions where they had been excluded. And Phil was my advisor for my master's paper, and I sat down with Phil, and those of you who may be teachers or professors know that students struggle to come up with interesting topics. I presented my topic to Phil, some cliched storylines. And at the end of the conversation, Phil said, "Your name is A'Lelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker?" And I think Phil knew the answer. She'd been but I wasn't talking about it. But Phil had been a reporter at Jet and Ebony. Her mother had been the editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, which was a really well-known black newspaper. And I said, "Yeah, that's my family." And Phil said, "That's what you're going to write about." And so that really validated it for me at a time when the publishing industry was, not really publishing books, not that they weren't being written, but books by or about black women. Roots was just about to come out, and that kind of changed the conventional wisdom. So that was when I really began to seriously do the research and interview the survivors, some people who had known Madam Walker. So to answer your question, were there things that surprised me? Everything surprised me. The story about Madam Walker essentially was Madam Walker had a hair care business, and she built a mansion. That was kind of what people knew. So all of those other things, where she lived, her political activism, her philanthropy, her patronage of the arts, all of those things, those were things that I uncovered because there had never been a major book written about her. But I will tell you two things that stunned me. One is that her political activism was so intense. She was good friends with Ida B. Wells, who we all know is the anti-lynching activist. And she and Ida B. Wells were spied upon by a black spy who worked at the War Department during World War I because they were so outspoken. Madam Walker was defending the rights of black soldiers, and in this, what was then a classified report, which I found the Military Intelligence Division at the National Archives, said that Madam Walker and Ida B. Wells were Negro subversives. So I loved that. It was like being on the Nixon's enemies list. So, to find out that yes, she was an entrepreneur, but to find out that she was also a political activist, that she used her platform and her wealth to try to make her community better, that was surprising to me. To find out that she, in 1917, when she had her convention, it had to have been one of the first conventions of American women in business. So all of those things were revelations to me. With A'Lelia Walker, it was, she had been painted as just such a dilettante that it was important to me to find out just how much of a patron of the arts she was. That her parties were not just parties, they were events with a purpose. That she was bringing people together in ways that other people hadn't been able to do. Yes, some of her, other friends in Harlem had wonderful houses on Strivers Row. Some of them had a great deal of wealth, not as much as she did, and they could have entertained, but she was the one who people wanted to come see. She was the one who could pull that off. So being able to find that out about her, that she wasn't this sort of, caricature that many others had created of her, was really important to me. Mm-hmm. So how do I translate my own experience and how, based on what we are experiencing today, and how much of this is related to the erasure? So I could do a dissertation, but but I will try to do the headlines. When I was a junior in high school and taking American history, my textbook said slaves, not enslaved people as some of us prefer to say now, slaves were contented, and it literally said that. And then in another paragraph it said because they were better off than free people because they were clothed and fed. Now, I was the only black person in that class. One of my friends says she's in the class, but I think maybe I wasn't speaking to her that week for whatever reason. But I knew that wasn't true. In my bones, I knew that wasn't true, but I didn't have the information. I didn't have the research. Fortunately, my grandfather, whose grandfather had been elected to state office in Arkansas during Reconstruction and was superintendent of prisons in Helena, Arkansas, and whose father had been valedictorian of his class, he told me, I knew a different story from him, but when I was sitting in that class, all I felt was just embarrassment and shame. And so it has been incredible for me to watch the last 50 years as scholarship has started to tell these stories that weren't told, and that we now have all of these books and studies and even Instagram pages that tell the story, and we are in Black History Month. And so I know that this cannot be dismantled because I'm going to keep telling the story. And it has been so heartening in the last couple of days to see the number of people who are doing their own thing about making sure that this history is told. And as we are in the midst of commemorating the 250th anniversary of America, a few years ago, I was so excited because all of these platforms were going to be telling the story in a more fulsome way, that we were going to be learning about people like Mum Bet, who was a woman who insisted on her freedom in the 1700s, and other people, other Black people who were part of the Revolutionary War. I even had my grandmother's, my grandmother's great-great-great-grandfathers both were in the Continental Army. They were free people of color in North Carolina. So I know there is another story. And I was hoping that that was going to be at the forefront. But you know what? I'm still going to tell that story. And a lot of people are still going to tell that story, no matter what other narrative there is. When I talk about my grandparents saving all of these, bless you, when I talk about my grandparents saving all of these items, that is the first step to making sure that we're not erased. And I have, too many people I know who, grandma's died, I got to get all this stuff out of the house, what are we going to do with this? And I'm the person in my family who cleans out everybody's house. I'm kind of the last man standing. But I go through everything, and I find the report cards and the photographs and the letters and, the mortgage payments, those kinds of things, because I know that if we don't save our own history, we are part of the erasure. So, and I would just say, this is the idea that you're going to pretend something didn't happen. So I went, it's just like it happened, and we're going to keep telling the story. But it means that another generation of people are going to be consigned to ignorance. And I'll close with this. So my high school, where Marie Johnson and I went, where we're both in the Hall of Fame, but there were 3,400 students or so, 3,200, 3,400 students in 3 grades. Suburban Indianapolis, excellent high school, excellent education, great resources, all the things. And my 50th reunion was a few years ago. And we were on a meeting Zoom call. I was vice president of student council. I was co-editor of the newspaper. I was that girl. And so we're on the call planning this reunion. And our school was about 96% white. But, we had our little community that was there. So I'm on this call as we're planning this. And it happened to be around the time that the Tulsa centennial, the centennial of the Tulsa massacre was happening. And one of my classmates said, Lily is what people knew me as. They said, Lily, did you know about Tulsa? And I'm like, yeah, I knew about Tulsa because I tried to find out about these things. I taught myself about Tulsa. And they were upset because they didn't know about it. And their children didn't know about it. And their grandchildren didn't know about it. And they wanted to know about it. And I think there are a lot of people who want to know the full truth. And so I'm counting on those folks. Thank you.